On the cold, blustery morning of February 18, 1947, one of the premier trains of the Pennsylvania Railroad left the tracks above a deep gorge outside of Altoona, Pennsylvania. 24 people were killed. More than 100 were injured. Investigations were opened and conclusions were drawn. One man carried the blame, and in time, the world moved on. The explanation seemed simple: speed and human error, case closed. But railroad wrecks are rarely that simple. Partnered with the Railroaders Memorial Museum in Altoona, we're reopening the case, digging through original archives, hiking out to the remote crash site high above the city, and rebuilding the Red Arrow from the ground up using historically accurate handcrafted animations in Unreal Engine 5. No shortcuts, no AI, just the evidence and the discoveries that it reveals along the way.
Everything's still here, except for the train.
This is the wreck of the Red Arrow on Part-Time Explorer. This documentary is made possible by a generous grant from the Wolf Kuhn Foundation, and we thank them for their support. A few years ago, I told the story of another Pennsylvania Railroad disaster, the wreck of the Broker. A K4 steam locomotive, a speeding train, a curve taken too quickly, and an engine man that got all the blame. That crash in New Jersey in 1951 became one of the most well-known steam wrecks in American railroad history. But there are really two K4 locomotive disasters of significance that resulted in mass casualties, and the other one happened first. 4 years earlier, in 1947, the Red Arrow derailed on the eastern slope of the Allegheny Mountains in Pennsylvania, killing 24 people and injuring more than 100 others. Like the Broker, it involved speed. Like the Broker, it involved a curve. But unlike the Broker, the full mechanics of what happened here have never been properly visualized or explained. That's why the Railroaders Memorial Museum asked me to help tell this story and finally complete the pair of documentaries. The Wreck of the Red Arrow isn't just a technical case study. It's a human story, one that unfolded in seconds, but left scars that lasted a lifetime on the passengers, the crew, and the families who never saw their loved ones again. And for decades, the mountainside kept its silence. Our investigations began in Altoona at the Railroaders Memorial Museum. Altoona is where the Pennsylvania Railroad, one of the greatest railroads in American history, built the largest railroad shop complex in the world. Locomotives and cars were built here, experiments were done, and new technology developed. Several key pieces of railroad technology used around the world have their origins right here. This was originally the Master Mechanics Building, and the Railroaders Memorial Museum now keeps the legacy of the railroad alive through displays and interactive exhibits. It's here that I meet Matthew Wolf, the museum's curator and the person who first proposed this documentary.
So we want any visitors that come to the museum, we want to show them not only the importance of the railroad, but the importance of the railroader, not just a steam engine or the shop buildings themselves. We want to talk about the individuals who operated the steam engines, worked in the shops, worked on the track gangs, 30, 40, even 50 years of their life working for a particularly dangerous occupation.
We have their archives, the exhibits, and their extensive rail yard of contemporary cars and locomotives at our disposal, including the legendary engine number 1361. in their roundhouse under restoration, a K4S locomotive identical to the one at the head of the Red Arrow. On top of all that, we're working with Dennis P. McIlnay's authoritative book, The Wreck of the Red Arrow, an American train tragedy. But what was the Red Arrow? Well, it all started in the roaring 1920s as America's industrial heartland pulsed with manufacturing might. One railroad set its sights on connecting Detroit's automobile empire with the great eastern cities, like New York and Philadelphia. This had already been done to some degree by the New York Central Railroad and the Baltimore and Ohio, but the Pennsylvania Railroad, arguably the leading railroad in the world at the time, threw its hat into the ring with an overnight express called the Red Arrow. The Pennsylvania Railroad was known as the standard railroad of the world, meaning the example by which all other railroads were to be measured. It was reliable, efficient, luxurious, and unstoppable. And in the 1940s, its reputation was virtually unblemished.
The original 61 miles of track from Harrisburg to Lewistown became a system whose network of tracks totals more than 26,000 miles. From one passenger train each day to more than 2,500 trains every day. From one freight train twice a week to more than 5,000 freight trains every 24 hours.
The Red Arrow got its name from the legendary 32nd Infantry of Michigan and Wisconsin, with a bold red arrow on their patches. But the name doubled as a play on the Pennsylvania Railroad's Tuscan red paint scheme as an arrow darting across the states. Introduced in the early fall of 1925, the Red Arrow began modestly as a route between Pittsburgh and Detroit, and over the following years the company extended the service directly to New York and Washington, D.C., giving passengers a through line from the industrial Midwest to the American seaboard. Running daily in both directions by 1926, the Red Arrow became the railroad's principal train, linking Detroit and the East Coast.
So you had train 68, the eastbound, and train 69, the westbound. They were night trains. So you could go to sleep, wake up at your destination the next morning.
As decades passed, through the Great Depression, through the Second World War, and into the post-war era, the Red Arrow matured. With the arrival of the streamliner age in the late 1930s, the train received upgraded equipment and amenities, bringing it in line with the Pennsylvania Railroad's modern image. The Red Arrow became a first-class train with overnight Pullman sleeper cars, high-end service, and fine dining.
It was a very first-class experience, from the waiters to the silver to the china, to the food that was being prepared. They had special silverware embossed with the Pennsylvania Railroad insignia. The china had a special pattern, and depending on the train or the time era, the china would change. So they would update it with different designs and really appeal to the passengers on board as something unique and special to them.
The train's hospitality staff was almost exclusively African American, staffed by members of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, who served the food in the dining car and portered the coach and Pullman cars. Often these men were well respected and generously tipped. Pullman cars were the elite luxury train cars in North America at the time. Built in Chicago, these fine train cars traveled the rails across the United States and Canada, accommodating over 26 million guests a year. Therefore, it's been said that Pullman operated the largest hotel chain in the world. The Pennsylvania Railroad hauled thousands of these Pullman cars at its peak, using the luxurious standards of the Pullman Company to bolster the Pennsylvania Railroad's already lofty reputation. In the rail yard of the Railroaders Memorial Museum are 20 pieces of rolling stock, including this Pullman sleeper car, similar to the ones that made up the Red Arrow.
This is a Pullman observation sleeper car called the Mountain View, built in 1949 by Pullman for the Pennsylvania Railroad first-class passenger train, the Broadway Limited, which was service between New York City to Chicago. Come down the main hallway here, and then you have your 3 bedrooms. Room A here is a single bedroom. This is room B, a family room. So you got 2 beds in here, one here, fold down to make an L. These chairs here would fold flat to fit underneath the beds. And then you had a full bathroom of a sink, toilet, and a shower. You got your closet here and a compartment for your shoes to go, luggage rack up top. Each room also had its own temperature control, had a fan, Pullman porter button, a light switch, and a night light. Sink, toilet, shower.
In the Pullman cars, benches were converted at night into bunks by porters on duty. The upper bunks would be accessed by a ladder, just like this one of the few surviving artifacts directly from the wreck of the Red Arrow. Now, this car was for the Broadway Limited and built shortly after the wreck of the 1947 Red Arrow, but it's a good example of what the Red Arrow hauled as it streaked through the cold midnight of the American Northeast. Its route was ambitious. From Detroit's Fort Street Union Depot, the train rolled south through Toledo, joined the Pennsylvania Railroad main lines east of Ohio, stopping in Pittsburgh, then threaded its way through the Allegheny Mountains, across the historic Old Stone Arch Bridge in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, across the Susquehanna Valley, and on towards Philadelphia and New York, with a connection to Washington, D.C. for a branch of the route. A 756-mile run, which usually took them 15 hours. Inside those cars, passengers might dine in the diner, drift off in private berths, or sip a late-night drink in the dining car while the rails hummed beneath them. For many, the Red Arrow was more than transportation. It was an overnight passage between worlds, bridging the motorized Midwest and the Atlantic's bustle, while offering a level of service that recalled the golden age of rail travel. The Red Arrow sat at its platform at the Fort Street Union Station in Detroit, Michigan, ready for a typical overnight run to New York City. The train had arrived around 8:30 that morning and was in the process of being turned over. Fresh provisions were brought on board. The porters refreshed the linens. The locomotives were given fresh water, sand, and coal. They weren't given a thorough inspection here, though. The inspections were conducted the night before, as the train stopped over in Pittsburgh. The train was inspected every time as it passed through Pittsburgh. The Red Arrow was a double-header, meaning at the front of the train were 2 locomotives working together to haul the long 14-car overnight express through the mountains of Pennsylvania. Both locomotives were K4S Class 462 engines built in Juniata, Pennsylvania.
It was developed here in Altoona due to the need for extra power on passenger locomotives. And the railroad had 425 of this particular model of steam locomotive, and it was their standard high-speed passenger locomotive.
Today, only 2 remain, and one of them is in the process of being rebuilt right here at the Railroaders Memorial Museum.
So this here is K4 1361, and when I bring people on tours, I wish I was showing them more of a steam engine put together, but this is pretty unique because you get to see what I like to call the skeleton of the steam engine.
Even in its stripped-down state, we get a feel for just how massive these locomotives were. These engines were not only giants, but speed demons as well, capable of speeds in excess of 100 miles an hour in the right conditions. The forward of the 2 K4s on this run of the Red Arrow was Locomotive 422, built in Altoona in July 1916. Mounted on the nose of the locomotive was a sign proudly reading the name of the train. The second was Locomotive 3771, built in Altoona in June 1920. Behind each of these locomotives was a tender, each matching the imposing size of the locomotive that pulled it. The engine man of the forward locomotive was Michael S. Billig of Altoona, Pennsylvania. Michael was no rookie at the throttle. By 1947, he was in his early 50s, a roughly 27-year veteran of the Pennsylvania Railroad. His whole working life had been on the rails. Night after night, he worked the Allegheny grades, bringing the Red Arrow up and down the summits, and was good at keeping his train on time. Being the engine man of the lead locomotive meant he was in charge of the throttle, of the brakes, and of the whole operation. His fireman in 422 was John Paraskak, a 28-year-old from Bellwood, just north of Altoona. Much of the train's feed systems had been automated by that point, with an automatic stoker system feeding the coal straight from the tender into the boiler, and water being injected automatically as well. But John had to oversee these machines that managed these automated processes and keep an eye on the gauges. Not an easy job, despite the new tools at his hands. The crew of the second locomotive was engine man Michael McArdle and fireman Ralph Henry. All four men were Pennsylvanians, and all four were experienced with the Pennsylvania Railroad. Although the crew of the first locomotive had command of the train's overall speed and brakes, the crew of the second locomotive were responsible for making sure that their locomotive contributed the right amount of power to the train overall, and to make sure that all onboard systems remained in good shape. Ultimately, though, the whole operation came down to engine man Billig in locomotive 422. Making up the Red Arrow's consist for this trip were 14 cars behind the 2K4s. They were an eclectic mix of different types, styles, and even eras. Red Arrow was hardly a uniform lineup. The first car, the one immediately behind the 2K4s and their tenders, was an RPO car, a railway post office. Car number 5473, used by the United States Postal Service to transport mail by rail across the country. Next was what's called a combine car. Half of the car was storage for passenger baggage, and the other half had coach seats for passengers. This was called Passenger Coach Baggage Car 4758. Next was a full coach car, Passenger Coach number 4289. This was the first of a handful of cars in the consist that sported the fleet of modernism design from the late 1930s, the lightweight, streamlined body with gold striping against the Tuscan red paint. After that began the Pullman cars for most of the remainder of the train. The first Pullman, which was the fourth car on the train, was Pullman the car, followed by Schrader's. The sixth car, nearing the middle of the train, was dining car number 7960. Here, dinner and breakfast were both cooked and served. Sirloin steak, fillet of sole, and turkey, served on bone china, were common fare, all cooked as the train raced through the night. Half the car was a kitchen, and half the car was sit-down restaurant seating. The next two cars stood out from the rest of the consist, the Pullman sleepers East Alton and Ogden Canyon. These were through cars. These were cars owned not by the Pennsylvania Railroad, but by other railroad companies whose cars the Pennsylvania Railroad was forwarding along on their next leg of the journey. East Alton belonged to New York Central, Ogden Canyon to the Union Pacific, and both carried the Pullman Company's distinctive Pullman green. Despite their different ownership, they were standard Pullman sleepers, like the others on the train, and both were to be occupied that night. Next came Pullman Cascade Timber, followed by Dixieland, then Cascade Heights, and finally Francis Hopkinson. Coming up the rear behind the Pullman cars was Passenger Coach 4013, and finally, Passenger Express Car 5959, a general baggage and freight car.
So this is a Pennsylvania Railroad B60 baggage car, and this is where your luggage would have gone. These doors would be slid open, just like this one, all the way, and a Pullman porter would actually carry your luggage and put it inside.
The morning turned into afternoon as the Red Arrow was readied for its next run, sitting at the platform. In the RPO at the front of the train, George Bowman was overseeing the sorting and direction of the registered mail. George was a U.S. Army veteran, a hunter, and involved in his church. A very busy man on top of his full-time job and his family. Tomorrow, February 18th, 1947, would be George's wife's birthday, and he just dropped a postcard in the mail as a greeting to her, until he could be with her in person soon. 9 other postal clerks worked alongside him as bag after bag of mail was brought onto the train. With so many large cities along the route, it's no surprise that the car was practically filled to the brim with mail that George and the other men would be sorting throughout the evening. One more visit to the Railroaders Memorial Museum rail yard before our train departs.
So this car here is an RPO, Railway Post Office car, called the Robert Hannigan. And this RPO car would have been very similar, exterior and interior wise, to the Red Arrow. So this is the interior of an RPO car, and you can see here, you can see these mail slots, and these mail slots is where your envelopes would have gone. So your mail clerks would have been sitting here sorting the mail all throughout this car. George Bowman would have been working in that morning of the derailment.
Passengers crowded the platform as they boarded. Ella Mae Wright was 36 years old and traveling home from Detroit to Altoona with her son and her sister. They boarded the combination passenger car near the front of the train and sat together between 2 rows of seats. A sailor took the seat next to her sister. There was a group of soldiers and sailors who were placed aboard the Red Arrow as they journeyed out east for their training. Their group made up a large chunk of the passengers in the combination car and the passenger coach behind it. Also boarding the train was an entertainment troupe, Rose's Midget Review, a group of little people who had just finished performances in Detroit and were now on their way to New York. Over 200 people were aboard the Red Arrow as the throttle was opened and the train began moving down the platform at 5:20 p.m. The sun was beginning to set now and the cold air became colder. It had been snowing heavily in the past few days, but the tracks were clear ahead. It was a smooth ride as the train coasted along beautifully as it left the Great Lakes region. Well, it was smooth everywhere except in the third car, the passenger coach. It was a bumpy, uncomfortable ride for Antoinette Turek, traveling with her 2 young daughters, Irene and Wanda, ages 7 and 3. They were traveling home to Altoona from Detroit, their father working for the Pennsylvania Railroad in Pittsburgh, and he'd be getting off from work right around the time that the train came into that city. He'd hopefully be able to join them. Red Arrow's first stop was Monroe, Michigan, as night fell. Here, the Red Arrow dropped off a handful of passengers, but picked up several more. Then it pulled through Toledo, Ohio, followed by Tiffin, Mansfield, and Canton before leaving Ohio and entering Pennsylvania. All the while, the train dropped off a few, but picked up more passengers. Dinner was served in the dining car almost immediately after departure and remained open for hours. One of the porters serving dinner in the dining car was Jim Corbett.
I said, Miss, I'm a waiter.
Waiter, not a porter.
See, Pullman porters and waiters never did get along together. No, we were strictly enemies. They had to pay for their meal.
Corbett was 33 years old and, like many of Red Arrow's crew, was from Altoona. He began work in the rail yards 9 years prior, then joined the on-board service, always working as a waiter.
I was supposed to make train number 66 back to Altoona. That was the American. But the boss called me up and told me to meet the Red Arrow because they had a troop movement on it.
For one reason or another, reasons which remain unclear, the Red Arrow was falling behind schedule when it pulled into Union Station in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, around midnight. Several passengers disembarked, and 3 mechanics approached the train to conduct a brief trip inspection, completely routine. Frank Turek was now off work and able to hop aboard the Red Arrow as it was laid over here in Pittsburgh, allowing him to join his wife for the final leg of their journey to their home in Altoona. He found them in the 3rd car where they had been sitting. After a brief conversation, Antoinette mentioned that their car had been rocking, a problem that he recognized as having a flat spot on one of the wheels. They relocated elsewhere. Little did they know that in their initial seats, it would have been very unlikely that they'd survive the night. But this relocation would be just another roll of the dice for them. The train was scheduled to depart Pittsburgh only a few minutes after it arrived, but that brief inspection was turning into a longer inspection and was now holding up the train. Other trains came and went as Red Arrow sat idling at the station, mechanics performing their inspection work on the locomotives. The inspectors reported to the conductor that temporary repairs were done to them and that once they arrived in Altoona, about 100 miles down the line, both engines would be swapped out for another K4. And from then on, the Red Arrow was planned to just be pulled by one K4 by itself. It had been scheduled to leave Pittsburgh just after midnight at 12:01, but here it was, chugging down the platform at 1:05 a.m., over an hour behind schedule. On board were 277 people. But wait, number 278 came running down the platform, racing to jump aboard the train before it left the station. This was Joseph Dutro. He had just dropped off his wife and kids at his mother-in-law's house and was now desperately trying to grab the Red Arrow so that he could make it to his job in Lancaster the next morning. The train gained speed as he leapt aboard the second car, the coach and baggage combine car, where he settled in. The train began picking up speed as it traveled east through the suburbs of Pittsburgh. Engine man Billig, in command of the forward locomotive, felt the pressure of this delay. He was responsible for getting his passengers to their destinations on time, and he felt that he could safely try to make up for the extra time in Pittsburgh, especially since the newly scheduled locomotive swap in Altoona would add another delay. The curves along the route had strict speed limits to prevent trains from tipping off the rails, but he could get away with speeding on the straightaways and putting on the brakes as curves approached. With the delay, Jim Corbett in the dining car was asked to start handing out refreshments free of charge to the passengers throughout the train.
Which I did.
Red Arrow accelerated and decelerated, rounding the curves and soaring down straightaways. Michael Billig was an experienced engine man who knew how to push the limits of the train while keeping within the safe limits of the line. Even within the first hour of departing Pittsburgh, the conductor of the Red Arrow, a man named George Hirschberger, noted how quickly Billig was making up time.
Mr. Hirschberger, that was the conductor. He said, "Damn, Mike's doing good. We picked up 15 minutes."
The train wound through the Conemaugh Valley and into Johnstown, Pennsylvania, site of the terrible Great Flood of 1889, crossing the old stone bridge that once blocked the burning debris after the disaster. The Red Arrow usually made a stop here when it went westbound, but not eastbound as it was now, allowing Billig to continue making up his time. The next stop would be Altoona in a little over an hour. Up and down the slopes, faster and then slower again. Passengers on board would later attest to just how jerky the ride was. For Matthew at the Railroaders Memorial Museum, the Red Arrow isn't just a wreck. It's an unanswered question. It came apart at a remote curve, near the summit of the Allegheny Mountains above the city, far from roads, far from towns, and far from easy access.
If we were to walk that way, how far is Bennington? Far.
So if we want to understand what actually happened, we have to go there. 12 miles out from Altoona is the AR Signal Tower. The tower oversaw a triangle formation of switches at the summit of the Allegheny Mountains. From here, the tracks were a sharp decline down the mountains into Altoona. On this grade, speed doesn't stay where you leave it. It only stays down if it's actively held there. As trains passed the AR Tower heading east, they were required to conduct a brake test before beginning their descent. The test confirmed that the brakes were working and were ready for the 12-mile downhill grade. The grade allowed no margin for error. It's one of the most dramatic stretches of railroad in the United States. The grade here is a steady 1.7% fall, nearly 100 feet per mile. That pulls at the weight of the locomotive the moment that the throttle closes. The track bends almost immediately. First a gentle curve, then a short straightaway, and then another bend, each one carved into the mountainside more than 80 years earlier. The most feared of them all was known as Bennington Curve, known for the town of Bennington that once existed nearby. It's an 8-degree curve which sweeps to the right atop a towering 200-foot embankment. On one side, the earth rises in a sheer rock cut. On the other, it drops away into an open canyon. A train entering the curve feels suspended between the mountain and the sky. The curve not only bends sharply, but continues its unbroken descent along the entire stretch. Because of this, a 35-mile-an-hour speed limit is enforced for all trains approaching it from the west, and a 30-mile-an-hour speed limit once you're in the curve. If a train exceeds the limit on approach, there is no practical way to recover before you hit the curve. Through this descent, the engineer's job becomes a constant balance of air pressure, brake reductions, and gravity. Too little braking, and the train accelerates dangerously. Too much, and the wheels risk locking or the brakes overheating. Every locomotive crew knew and respected this hillside. Past Bennington are a few more curves before the train would traverse the world-famous Horseshoe Curve, and finally, at the bottom of the slope, the city of Altoona, the beating heart of the Pennsylvania Railroad. But of this 12-mile run, it was Bennington that posed the first obstacle for the Red Arrow. And that is where we are walking. How you feeling, David?
I'm ready.
You ready?
Yeah.
Got a long hike.
Okay.
Oh, they're ready now.
You guys find a stick. Find a stick.
Bennington was remote, requiring a 2-mile walk along a washed-out dirt road. Not a hard walk, but a cold one. The final mile of the walk was alongside the railroad bed, right where the track began its descent down the mountain towards Altoona. A stretch of track known as the Slide, a steep downhill slope terminating abruptly with the sharp curve of Bennington. This was the stretch of track where 35 miles an hour was the limit. This part of the forest was peaceful, interrupted only by a passing freight train or two. As we neared Bennington, we ascended a rocky hillside that overlooked the curve and the gulch behind it. From here, we finally see the treacherous section of track where it all took place. From this elevated position, we can also see one key difference in the track bed today and how it looked back in 1947. Instead of 4 tracks, there are now 3. We're here overlooking Bennington Curve, and actually track 2 is the relevant track. It's the one that the Red Arrow was on, and that track has been removed since 1947. Tracks 1, 3, and 4 are still there, so you can't see the original track 2, but you can see the space where it would have been.
The 2 inner tracks were the passenger train. Track 2 was for eastbound passenger, track 3 was for westbound passenger, and the 2 outers, track 1, track 4, were for freight. So the Red Arrow was traveling eastbound on track 2 when it flipped over the mountain.
Since leaving our car, we've now walked the entire length from the AR Tower to the wreck site, the stretch of track where all of the buildup took place, leading to the calamity. At 3:17 a.m. on February 18, 1947, the Red Arrow approached the AR tower. As it did, engine man Billig closed the throttle, or in automobile terms, that's taking his foot off the gas. And then he put on the brakes. Now, these trains have two different types of brakes. Brakes on the cars of the train behind the engines, which were powered by compressed air, and brakes on the locomotives directly. The car brakes created drag behind the train and slowed the train down smoother, while the locomotive brakes caused a hard, abrupt stop at the front of the speeding train. Engine brakes were harder, rougher, and costly to maintain and replace, so enginemen usually relied on air brakes in the cars. Conductor Hirschberger was somewhat near the dining car at this time, and made a note of engine man Billig's test by monitoring the air brakes in the car that he was in. Two men were on duty that night in the AR tower. They clocked the Red Arrow passing through at around 20 miles an hour as it performed its brake tests, before increasing speed slightly. Red Arrow continued through the town of Gallitzin, through the New Portage Tunnel, and out the other side at approximately 30 miles an hour by Billig's estimation. The K4S locomotives were not equipped with speedometers to tell them precisely how fast they were going, and instead enginemen relied on judging their speed based on feel and comparing time on a pocket watch with mileposts that they passed. From here, the story becomes uncertain. The witnesses and the evidence disagree. But here is what we do know. The stretch of track between AR Tower and Bennington Curve is a steep downhill segment known as the Slide, mentioned earlier, which leads directly to Bennington Curve. The speed limit on the Slide is 35 miles an hour. Red Arrow accelerated from 30 to 35 and then continued faster and faster down the slope. It rode along track 2, one of the inner two tracks. On track 3, the other inner track, were two westbound locomotives at a complete stop, waiting for Red Arrow to clear the tracks ahead of them. The crews of these two locomotives saw the Red Arrow soaring past them heading down the hill. Its car brakes threw off sparks, but the train continued to accelerate. 40, 45, 50, 55, 60, 65, 70. At around 70 miles per hour, the Red Arrow hit Bennington Curve and jumped the tracks. Some reported the scene was as silent as the grave. Others said they heard screaming immediately. The entire forward section of the Red Arrow was destroyed. The locomotives twisted and mangled. The tenders at the bottom of the gulch, crushed by a Pullman sleeper car sitting on top of them. The RPO car and passenger coach shattered and on their sides. All was darkness. We walked along the side of the embankment where these cars had fallen, looking for any remaining traces that may linger.
You could see that 200-foot gorge. It's bad. We're not going to get too close to the track because that's railroad property. We're going to stay hugging the edge where it becomes state game land. The Red Arrow would have shot around this corner, would have come flying off the track and fallen right down the gorge, right about where I'm standing, down into that creek.
This is where the dining car came to rest, resting against rocks and trees, ready to snap at any moment. Just 5 minutes prior, as the train passed AR Tower, Jim Corbett was in the dining car having finished his rounds of handing out complimentary snacks. In the car with him was Red Arrow's brakeman, Ray Newhouse. The two of them noticed the Red Arrow began to really pick up speed as it left the tunnel and began descending the slide.
And he said, if he don't slow down before we hit Benny, we ain't gonna make it. That's what brakeman said. And he didn't slow down before we hit Benny. Whenever we hit the curve, Only thing I did,
Ray was thrown across the car and slammed into the forward end of the train. The dining car's stove broke loose and flew after him.
the train went, the dining car went straight up in the air like that, and we broke couplings from the rest of the train.
It slid down the embankment, smashing through trees, but managed to veer leftward and avoid being wrecked between the rest of the train cars. The car creaked and groaned in complete blackness, save for one small light on the ceiling that still burned.
I didn't lose conscience. Only thing I lost was a shoe. But anyhow, I looked around and there wasn't no light on, but one light, and that was in the center there. So I said, where am I at? So I thought of the trainman. So I went up there and I looked up there and I seen Ray up there. So I pulled him back to the light so I could see, and I thought he was dead. And then something said for me to hit him. So I hit him across the face to see, because he had turned white as this sheet. This paper here. So I started hitting him like that across there, and I seen color come back in his face. Then whenever I hit him about 4 or 5 times, he started moving his head. And then he came to. I took a chair and I broke a window, which you'll see in the picture, one of the pictures in the dining car. There's one window broke in that picture. That's where I come out. Now, how I got him out of that window, I never know till yet. I never know how I got him up that hill, because I had to take him up the hill. I looked down, I was full of blood. I know where that come from, too. Of course, I had went over some bodies, no doubt.
Corbett reached the top of the hill, dragging Ray the brakeman to the top with him. Once they reached the tracks, Newhouse jumped to his feet and ran back along the track. He just took off running, despite his injuries. It's not documented as to why he did this, but chances are he was a bit delirious, he was still getting his thoughts together, and the only conscious thought he had was that he has to run back and alert the signal tower to stop any incoming trains from coming through. A speeding downhill train would plow right through the remnants of the Red Arrow and the crowd of survivors now amassed on the tracks. In the frigid night, they began lighting fires on the tracks to keep warm. It was excruciatingly cold when people started emerging from the wreckage. A lot of them had been sleeping, so if they had a private car, they would have been in their pajamas or their undergarments, coming out into this bitterly cold, below freezing weather. At the top of the embankments along the railroad tracks, engine man Michael Billig sat, stunned. When Billig's locomotive, engine 422, jumped the tracks and crashed onto its left side, Billig was on the right side and was likely flung out of the locomotive as the cab broke apart. As it did, the steam lines ruptured, blasting scalding hot steam and water on the crew of the cab. Billig was already on his way out. His fireman, stationed on the left side, Fireman John Paraskak, would be crushed by the falling engine, pinned and scalded by the steam blast. He did not survive. Likely a similar hell took place in engine 3771, which jumped the tracks and followed 422 down the embankments, shattering to pieces and killing both crewmen on board. They would have continued sliding down and would have crushed the cars resting down beneath them if the locomotive hadn't been caught by a rock outcropping. This is that very outcropping, still here today. This was where Billig's locomotive came to a stop, and he was injured. His fireman had been thrown clear of the wreckage and was killed. Billig woke up with lacerations, a crushed chest and punctured lung, and severe burns. Waiter Jim Corbett approached him to see how he was.
When I seen Mike, he was coming up like that, and I touched him, and when I touched him like that, all that skin just come off his hand. He was scalded. How that man lived till up until he died, I don't know.
The first contact with the outside world was from conductor Hirschberger, who, like brakeman Ray Newhouse, had run up the tracks to stop any incoming trains. A long, heavy freight train, which would have been virtually unstoppable once it began its descent, was just entering the slide when Hirschberger called for them to stop. They did. Hirschberger continued running down the line to find a telephone to call the dispatchers, but the freight train's crew disembarked and ran to investigate the crash ahead of them. Bringing wrecking tools with them, they were the first help to arrive on the scene, and it would be a long time before any additional assistance of significance would follow. They were very isolated. The freight train's crew reached the rear of the Red Arrow first. The last 3 cars were still on the tracks, mostly undamaged, though full of injured passengers who had been thrown around by the sudden stop. The car in front of them was also mostly undamaged, only the forward truck was off the tracks. The 3 cars ahead of this one, the Pullman sleeper cars, were also upright and in good shape, but they had jumped the tracks towards the ravine. Ahead of that, however, is where the real destruction began, with Pullman sleeper East Alton teetering over the edge. The men from the freight train got to work immediately, using their tools to pry open doors and windows to let survivors begin climbing out. Most of the forward cars were scattered down the embankment, with one exception: car number 2, the combined passenger and baggage car. Despite the fact that every unit forward of it and several behind it had toppled down the ravine, baggage car number 4758 had derailed and violently tore down the tracks around the bend, toppling onto its side, but it did not fall down the ravine. The rear section of the car was crushed in by the weight of the train behind it. Unfortunately, the rear half was the half of the car dedicated to passenger seating, and it had been overcrowded. So badly wrecked was the car, and so horrible was it for those inside, that passenger baggage car number 4758 would come to be known as the Death Car. Joseph Dutro considered himself lucky when he caught the Red Arrow at the last minute as it left Pittsburgh a few hours prior, hopping aboard this crowded combine car and taking a seat. He had fallen asleep in the moments leading up to the wreck, suddenly waking up to the feeling of the car derailing and riding across the ballast rock. Next, he and everyone inside were slammed hard against the forward bulkhead, and then against the back as the cars behind them slammed into their car. They crashed over the seats and finally against the side of the train as it toppled over. Dutro was mostly uninjured, his second stroke of luck for the night. He was one of the first to his feet, taking a suitcase and smashing through a window to create an exit, helping several people out behind him. Ella Mae Wright, who was in the same car, got up screaming that she couldn't find her son. She was relatively unharmed, and so was her sister. She managed to find her son, and he was all right as well, but the sailor, who had been seated next to them, lost his leg. All 4 were lucky to be alive, but a simple matter of seat positioning determined who made it out mostly unscathed and who would come out with permanent injury. Smashed, sheared, twisted, and crushed behind the combine car lay the remains of passenger coach 4289, seemingly draped like a wet noodle over the curvature of the embankment. This car was so badly damaged that it was also occasionally labeled as the Death Car. Most of the passenger casualties took place between these 2 cars, but the problems were only just beginning for the people in the cars at the bottom of the gulch, between 150 and 200 feet down. There was no path, no road, no trail out. Anyone who went into the ravine was cut off, unless they were able to pull themselves up, like Jim Corbett had done. Assistance was slow to arrive, but not for lack of effort. As soon as word arrived in Altoona of the disaster, the Pennsylvania Railroad mustered up a relief train 14 cars long full of doctors, police, and equipment. This took time to assemble before it began the long, grueling haul up the hill into the Alleghenies, the same stretch of track that the Red Arrow fought against going the other direction. Meanwhile, an isolated group of survivors were still coming to grips with what had happened. At the far bottom of the embankment was Pullman sleeper McCarr, on its side and farthest from the tracks. The occupants were badly battered and shaken up, but most, if not all, were alive. The new threat was the cold. The temperature was around 10 degrees Fahrenheit or minus 12 Celsius. The warmth inside the car was rapidly lost. While the survivors were assembling in a lower part of the gorge, some of the men actually went back to the wreckage to start digging out coats and blankets to give to the women and children in their pajamas and undergarments so that they wouldn't freeze to death. In the disorienting darkness, they didn't know where they were. It wasn't until nearly an hour after the disaster that the survivors in the car were able to locate the track bed above. Somehow, they have to ascend 200 feet up this 75% grade, up to the top of Bennington Curve, where they can start walking back to the nearest civilization. So what they did was they sort of formed a human chain, linking arms and helping each other to get up. Now, I tried climbing up a little bit, and it's significantly sharper right here where a lot of these cars came down, but it's a little bit of an easier grade off to the side, and I think that's probably the path they took. By the time they reached the track bed, most of the people had been helped out of the cars at the top of the hill, although many more were still trapped in the wrecked cars along the slope. It was around dawn when the rescue train arrived. By then, some of the survivors had begun trekking back to Gallitzin, while others huddled by the fires on the tracks. The dining car staff had been giving out the remaining food that survived the derailment, but this relief train brought all sorts of food and supplies for anyone else who didn't get any food yet. The train offloaded an army of people to assist, from medical personnel to technicians with heavy equipment to extract people. They got to work right away, bringing torches and metal cutters down the cliff into the gulch to the smashed cars. It wasn't only a train that was sent. When the news broke in Altoona, first responders rushed up the mountain roads to get as close to Bennington as possible, but unfortunately, the closest road was still a long hike from the wreckage. We're on Sugar Run Road right now. This is the road that most of the people from Altoona drove up. This is the closest they could get their cars and ambulances and fire trucks to the wreck site of the Red Arrow. You can see Bennington right up there. Bennington Curve is right there where the hills, through this closer row of trees, where the hills sort of dip down. That there is where the tracks formed Bennington Curve. From Sugar Run Road, another wave of rescue effort began the long hike across the snow-covered mountains. Between the train and the vehicles on Sugar Run Road, hundreds of people descended onto Bennington Curve to help how they could. Not everyone there was interested in helping. Some just came to look. Others were there to capture the story for the newspapers. Photographers snapped pictures of the rescue efforts, of the relief train's personnel getting to work, of the crowds of gawkers and rubberneckers swarming the rocky hills that flanked Bennington, and of men cutting into overturned cars looking for survivors. Which brings us to the train's forwardmost car, the RPO car. Laying on its side with the roof pointed down the slope, the RPO car had been nearly silent this entire morning. George Bowman had been in the RPO car at the front of the train, immediately behind the locomotives and tenders, with 9 other clerks sorting mail and packages. 5 of the 10 men in the RPO car were killed outright. George had been thrown inside the car and snagged his foot, and he was dangling upside down by his injured feet. And he hung there for an excruciating 9 hours. All the while he was dangling there, he could see the body of his dead brother, Harland, laying next to him. Finally, the rescuers began cutting through the side of the car with their torches, extracting the 4 other men that were still alive, leaving only George, who needed extra untangling to be pulled out. And he started guiding them in how they could release his feet so they could pull him out. His thoughts during this time were with his wife and kids as he drifted in and out of consciousness. A newspaper reported that he had made out a will on a slip of postal paper and handed it to a rescuer, but this wasn't likely. The longer it took to cut George free, the more he faded. He guided the rescuers as best as he could until finally he was loose. George Bowman was the last person pulled from the wreck of the Red Arrow alive. Some of the injured had been taken back to ambulances on Sugar Run Road or back in Gallitzin, while others were loaded onto special train cars provided to shuttle them back to Altoona to be taken to hospitals there. George Bowman was brought back to the city as quickly as possible for treatment at the Altoona Hospital. The Altoona Hospital and nearby Mercy Hospital were ready to receive patients, but they were some distance from the train station in Altoona, so they set up makeshift emergency rooms in downtown Altoona's Penn Alto Hotel and another even closer to the station at a place called the Canteen. Much of Altoona's downtown has been demolished and rebuilt since 1947. The beautiful old train station built by the Pennsylvania Railroad is gone and replaced with this. And immediately adjacent to the train station is Altoona's post office. A USO building from World War II stood on this spot to support troops traveling through the city. That was the Canteen. The large building waiting to be dismantled made the perfect makeshift hospital and morgue. The Turek family had been pulled out of passenger coach 4289. All of them were alive. Frank, Antoinette, and their young daughters Irene and Wanda. Prior to the wreck, they had been sorting their luggage and putting on their heavy winter coats, anticipating disembarking in Altoona, which author Dennis McElnay speculates may have offered them additional padding during the crash that saved their lives. Frank, however, was in bad shape. He had been loaded onto the relief train with a broken back and a punctured lung. He was in such bad shape that his friend, who was part of the relief effort, didn't recognize him at first. They shared a cigarette as the train made its way back to Altoona. Survivors were coming in by the dozens off the hospital trains, but back at the wreck site, with the injured finally being managed, it was time to begin extracting the bodies. It was a gruesome task. One woman in the front of the train was crushed so badly that the first responders found her by following the trail of fragments of her scalp on the track bed, headed to the car that she was in. The first 5 bodies were hauled out on stretchers and lined up by the tracks before being loaded onto the rail car to be brought down to Altoona with a group of survivors. When the train arrived, the bodies were taken to the Canteen and laid out for identification. 2 men, 2 women. 2 were black, 2 were white, and the 5th was a 5-year-old boy. This was Charles Oliver Steinhardt. When he was uncovered, many in the Canteen began loudly weeping. The shock had worn off, and reality was setting in. The Canteen became the command center for disaster relief, with coroners coming in and out, survivors filtering through before heading on to the hospitals, the Red Cross lending a hand, and a temporary telephone dispatch being set up. Partway through the recovery, the telephone system broke down, so they called in the Boy Scouts, who became runners between the Canteen, the train station, and the hospitals. As the survivors continued to come into the Canteen, a large group of children, all injured, some of them quite badly, came in. They were all rushed in with extra care, doctors frantically tending to these children, but as they got to work, they realized they weren't actually children. These were the members of Rose's Midget Review. Fortunately, though badly battered, every one of them survived the crash. George Bowman was in good spirits and to his family seemed to be doing just fine. But at 9:10 that night, with his family beside him, George Bowman died in the Altoona Hospital. He was buried in Pleasant Hills Cemetery. The day I visited him was an icy one, as cold as the night the Red Arrow was wrecked. I wandered for a while, struggling to find him until just before I was ready to give up. I don't know how, but I found it, iced and overgrown. George C. Bowman, postal worker, lost in the wreck of the Red Arrow, February 18th, 1947. February 21st, the day of his burial, That postcard that he sent arrived at home. It wished his wife a happy birthday. Her birthday was the day that he died. The entire Turek family had been hospitalized, although the little girls were in there only as a precaution. 3-year-old Wanda was afraid of being in her hospital room alone, so she was allowed to snuggle with her father, who comforted her lovingly until she had the courage to return to her room. Just after she left, Frank Turek, pulled out of the third car, died shortly after 11:15 that night. In the end, 24 people were killed, including 3 of the 4 engine crew and 6 of the 10 postal workers. The remaining 15 victims were passengers. Around 140 men, women, and children were injured, many permanently. From the moment the relief crew was on site, investigations into the disaster began. The Interstate Commerce Commission, better known as the ICC, regularly looked into crashes and began surveying the wreckage and photographing the sites, even calling on survivors to offer testimony. That investigation would go on for a few weeks, but the priority was concluding any on-site work so that the wreckage could be cleared. At the same time, the United States Postal Service sent a crew out to recover the mail scattered at the wreck to continue on for delivery. The cars of the Red Arrow were hauled away within a day or two of the wreck, and the track was cleared, repaired, and reopened. Most of the cars in the second half of the consist were returned to service, while most of the cars in the forward half were scrapped. As the wreckage of the Red Arrow was still being cleaned up, another rail disaster occurred right on its doorstep. 10 days after the wreck, late in the night as the wrecking crew worked overtime, the Sunshine Special, a train run jointly between the Pennsylvania Railroad and the Missouri Pacific, made its way up the grade around Bennington. As the train reached Gallitzin at the top of the hill, Cascade Mirage, the Pullman at the rear of the train, came uncoupled and began a runaway descent down the hill. The flagman shouted for passengers to take cover, and the porter rushed to pull the emergency brakes. It glided past the Red Arrow's wreck, nearly toppling over onto the workers cleaning up the sites, and then continued down the mountain. It jumped the tracks a mile later, killing the porter and injuring a dozen others on board. This accident underscored what the Red Arrow had already proven, that this stretch of track was unforgiving and small mistakes could turn into a catastrophe. The 2 locomotives remained in place until March 10th, almost 3 weeks after the disaster, when 4 derricks were hauled in on tracks 3 and 4. 2 of them were 150-ton and the other 2 were 250-ton. Work began around 9 a.m. with efforts first focusing on recovering locomotive 3771. Several lines were wrapped around the distorted and smashed engine. The derricks got to work, and slowly, very slowly, the dead engine began to move uphill. It took hours for these big machines to move the heavy old K4, dragging against the frozen ground all the way. It struggled and slipped, but continued its way back up. It wasn't until around 1 p.m. when the engine was hoisted onto the track bed. The chassis of the locomotive were still in good enough shape that it was decided that they would be placed back onto the rails and towed into Altoona, rather than loading it onto a flatbed. Icicles still hung from it, and for the first time ever, the terrible damage on the other side of the engine was now visible. K4s are solid. They feel indestructible when you're looking at one. But here, this heavy behemoth was bent up like a toy, and now off to the scrap pile. Then work began on 422. It was very much the same process, dragging it up the embankment and placing it down on the tracks. Both K4 locomotives were scrapped. As the investigations continued, all eyes were on engine man Billig. The ICC interviewed him while he was still in the hospital recovering. However, he would be called in later to give in-person testimony for the coroner's report. He was still in pain, still bearing scars, and had lost 25 pounds since the accident. He believed that the red arrow must have struck something on the tracks that caused them to derail. Well, the tracks had been routinely inspected prior to the crash, and nothing out of the ordinary was reported. The derailment destroyed the rails on the curve of tracks 2, 3, and 4, but there was no evidence of prior damage having been there. On top of that, 2 different trains passed through Bennington Curve only a few minutes prior to the wreck of the Red Arrow. They didn't encounter any problems. Ultimately, the idea of the Red Arrow striking something on the tracks or the tracks themselves being faulty was ruled out entirely. The tipping speed for a K4 on Bennington was calculated to be between 65 and 70 miles per hour, so that's at least how fast the Red Arrow was moving. It was all a matter of speed, and the question of how fast the Red Arrow was going when it hit the curve and why was the real mystery. Well, it turns out Bennington was already such a concern for the Pennsylvania Railroad that they installed a mechanism to track how fast each passing train traverses the curve. Unfortunately, though, it couldn't help the investigators. It worked by recording the time that a train enters the curve and recording the time that it leaves, and then calculates the difference. But because the Red Arrow entered the curve and never left it couldn't do its calculation. It should be noted, though, that the Pennsylvania Railroad pulled up Billig's speed history on Bennington Curve. He never went through it too fast. He always kept the train within the permitted speed limit. Was Billig speeding this time, though, because of how behind schedule the Red Arrow was? He may not have sped at Bennington in the past, but he was known as a fast engineman. Ray Newhouse and Jim Corbett noted that the train had made up a significant amount of time by speeding on the straightaways.
Well, I knew a lot, practically all the engineers, just like Mike, who I was in the wreck with. I knew him. Now, he was a makeup man. He was a good engineer, but he was a speedster. We left Pittsburgh an hour and 5 minutes late, and he picked up 15 minutes between Pittsburgh to Derry.
On the other hand, conductor Hirschberger would testify that the train wasn't speeding at all after leaving Pittsburgh. On the contrary, he actually said that the train had lost an additional 4 minutes because they were running slow. It's his word against theirs. So little is known about the moments leading up to the crash. 3 of the 4 men in the locomotive cabs were killed in the disaster. The one survivor was engine man Billig. He told investigators that he had been keeping the train close to the speed limit down through the slide towards Bennington, keeping the throttle closed so that the train wasn't being given any additional power. It was simply coasting downhill on gravity. But as the train came closer to the curve, it began picking up speed. He applied the air brakes to the cars to keep the train in check. Then he leaned out the window of the cab and looked forward. When he glanced back in, he saw that the throttle had somehow jumped from fully closed to open. The train rapidly accelerated as Billig closed the throttle once more, but by then the train was speeding down the tracks and jumped the curve. There are many flaws in his account. For one, the train wouldn't be able to accelerate from 35 to 70 in such a short stretch, even with gravity helping. The point where the train began picking up speed would have been much earlier, perhaps at the exit of the tunnel. And what about the throttle? Could it have possibly jumped open as he described it? John Turkelly, a former engine man for an identical K4S locomotive, shares his thoughts on Billig's claims.
This is the throttle here. So the engineman would be sitting in the seat like this and looking out the window or looking through the window. 2 things about the controls here, right? This is the throttle, to let the steam into the cylinders and control the speed. There is a ratchet mechanism to the throttle. You can see here there is a release lever, okay, and the quadrant that has the teeth on it is up there right where the throttle rod is going through the boiler. And you have to squeeze this release handle to get it to disengage from the ratcheting teeth, right? So you have to physically squeeze this handle to release it. All right, this is a throttle closed position. And so he said he was using a minimum amount of throttle. Well, this is locked onto the quadrant. So to actually get that to move, there would have to be some force applied to this release handle, and that's not going to move on its own.
No, it's highly unlikely that the throttle physically jumped. More likely, Billig misinterpreted what he was seeing in a high-stress moment, and the train had already begun accelerating. His story had changed anyway, from there likely being an obstruction on the track to the engine accelerating all by itself. The ICC themselves felt that he was no longer credible either. Instead, they leaned on other witnesses, and there were several. When the Red Arrow passed the AR tower for its brake check, the two operators confirmed that the train was not speeding. That changed as the train emerged from the new Portage Tunnel. The crew of the two stopped locomotives were less than half a mile away from Bennington Curve, the point of derailment. They noted that the train was traveling around 50 miles per hour as it passed them. This was not a last-minute acceleration like Billig had stated. That train was speeding long before the curve. But then they testified to something else that was very interesting. Sparks were coming off the brakes of the train cars, visible, bright sparks, but none from the locomotives. Brakes were not being applied to the locomotives. As mentioned earlier, the trains had two different brake systems. The air brakes, which applied to the entire train, every car, and included the locomotives, and then the brake system that was isolated only to the locomotives. Engine men leaned more on the air brakes than on the locomotive brakes. However, to these witnesses, the most visible braking effort appeared to be coming from the cars, suggesting that braking was underway, but not at a level sufficient enough to arrest the train's acceleration. Is it possible that something was wrong with the brakes in the locomotives? There's testimony to back this up. Jim Corbett remembers speaking directly with Ray Newhouse, the train's brakeman, just before the wreck.
We knew something was wrong whenever we knew it. Well, I didn't know it. He knew it. We didn't have no air. He said, "Corbett, we ain't got no brakes."
What if Billig wasn't entirely at fault? What if he was just bad at explaining himself and panicked? What if the train got away from him? Not because the brakes failed, but because braking began too late to overcome gravity on that grade. In Pittsburgh, 3 hours before the wreck, the Red Arrow was given repairs on the locomotives and told that they'd be swapped out once they arrived in Altoona. What those repairs specifically were could hold a clue to this mystery. Historian Bob Kettenheim has looked into these repairs for us, but there are no known records existing of what these repairs were or the reason for them. The ICC found no evidence that the repairs in Pittsburgh affected brake performance, and post-wreck testing confirmed that the brake systems were mechanically sound. But still, some people suggest that the air brakes may have malfunctioned, and maybe Billig wasn't entirely to blame. The ICC ruled this out entirely, but for Charles Morgan, an air brake technician with the Pennsylvania Railroad in 1947, this felt like a real possibility. From the moment he found out about the crash, he was nervous and anxious. He went out to the wreck site to help how he could, and then he returned to the city. Morgan came to downtown Altoona, and he went right to the canteen, which was behind the post office behind me. And he stood there among hundreds of spectators who were crowded around to see if they could catch a glimpse of what was going on. Initially, he hesitated, but he entered the building, and when he came in, he was so overcome that he collapsed to the floor. The first responders inside actually believed
He was one of the casualties of the train wreck. They tried treating him, they couldn't help him. He died right there.
Some believe he felt a sense of guilt. Whether that guilt was justified or not, we will never know. Some could argue that Charles Morgan was Red Arrow's 25th and final victim. Another possibility is that Billig believed the throttle was fully closed when it was not. But on this grade, power was not required for the train to accelerate. Gravity alone could account for the speed that the Red Arrow reached. When the ICC investigated the factors at play in the disaster, they didn't have the same 3D tools at their disposal as we do, and they didn't have as many first-hand survivor accounts as researchers such as Bob Kettenheim and Dennis McIlnay have amassed over the years. We do. We went on site to investigate, as did the ICC, but we went a step further by using LiDAR scans of Bennington Curve to show us the exact topography of the grade and slope. Our train models are built from the exact same plans in Juniata that the real trains were built from. We can see them in 3D, in their final state. The cars smashed on top of each other, twisted and rent, and forensically reversed the clock to take them from point B, wrecked on the embankment, back to point A, in line and speeding down the track. The conditions are nearly exact. All information available has been taken into account. We can now look at the wreck of the Red Arrow like never before. "3:15 a.m., February 18th, 1947. The Red Arrow is somewhere around 45 minutes to an hour behind schedule. There are 278 people on board, 238 of which are passengers. 14 cars in the consist, 2 locomotives and tenders. Engine man Michael Billig is at the controls of the forward locomotive and now slowing the train down for a running brake test as it approached the AR Tower near Gallitzin, Pennsylvania, marking the start of a long descent into Altoona. The AR Tower clocked the Red Arrow's passing speed at about 20 miles an hour. Both the towerman and conductor Hirschberger confirm a successful brake test. Billig opens the throttle up halfway and the Red Arrow returns to cruising speed, 35 miles an hour, as it weaves through Gallitzin and the New Portage Tunnel. Emerging from the tunnel, the stretch of track known as the Slide begins, and gravity starts pulling the train forward. Whether or not the throttle was fully closed, gravity immediately began pulling the heavy express downhill, and speed began to build. Billig leans out the window and notices the speed picking up, believing he has closed the throttle, and applies the air brakes. But it's not enough. The train continues to pick up speed. Passengers and crew notice this. The train has become more or less a runaway. Jim Corbett and Ray Newhouse in the dining car notice this as well. The train rockets past the standing locomotives on track 3. Billig looks back into the cab in alarm to see what's wrong and noticed the throttle not where he expected it to be, a moment that later loomed large in his mind. He jams it back to closed position as the train hits Bennington Curve, turning to the right. By the time the Red Arrow reached the curve, the question was no longer whether it could be saved. The train was already moving too fast. As the locomotive entered the curve, centrifugal force began to act immediately. The tipping of the forward engine was nearly instantaneous. The rails beneath it hadn't been damaged, which means the engine jumped. The center of gravity of the K4 steam engine shifted outward, and in a fraction of a second, the force of the curve overwhelmed the force holding it to the track. The engine rolled outward off of track 2 and sliding across tracks 3 and 4 to the embankment. The second locomotive, coupled tightly behind it, had no chance to react. As the lead engine rolled, it was violently pulled with it, wrenched sideways by thousands of tons of momentum that it couldn't resist. Almost instantly, the second engine tipped as well. The head end of the Red Arrow was gone. Both locomotives left the rails at overturning speed, slamming onto their sides and sliding off the embankment. Their mass carried them downward, tumbling into the gulch below the curve. Behind them, their tenders were dragged along with them. For a brief moment, they continued straight ahead, heavy, fast, and suddenly unrestrained. Then the drawbars twisted, the safety bars deformed, the tenders were torn loose, lifted, and flung outward, following the engines down the slope. One overturned violently, and the other was thrown even farther, its body separated from its trucks as it rolled. Car number 1, the railway post office car with 10 men working inside it, was pulled off the track by the locomotives, then jackknifed around down the embankments, broke loose from them, coming to rest on its right side with its rear end facing forward. The coupling between cars 1 and 2 broke when the RPO car jackknifed, and car 2, the combine car, stayed closer to the track bed. It would have fared better had car number 3 not slammed hard into the passenger end of the car. The car telescoped, absorbing enormous energy end on. Its structure collapsed inward, pinning it close to the roadbed rather than throwing it outward. The third car, a passenger coach, slammed into the back end of car 2 with the momentum of the train behind it, which then pivoted the car off the rear end of car 2 and lifted the rear end off the track and down the embankment. Car 4, the first of the heavyweight Pullman sleepers, car named Makar, was a powerhouse of momentum, dragging the rear of car 3 off the embankment with it, going partially airborne and shooting down straight to the bottom of the gulch. Instead of stopping, it rode up over the wreckage already in motion below it before dropping heavily onto one of the overturned tenders. It did not simply slide into the gulch, it fell into it. The fifth car, Pullman sleeper Schrader's, followed closely behind. By then the violence was beginning to collapse in on itself. Its speed was lower, the debris field was thicker. It tipped, slid, and came to rest above the fourth car, short of the bottom of the slope. Next came the dining car. It left the rails later still, when much of the train's energy had already been spent. It slid down the embankment, but did not plunge, coming to rest partway down the slope, damaged, but not destroyed. The seventh car reached the very edge of the embankment. It tipped, it leaned, it teetered, and then it stopped. Behind it, the remaining cars derailed more gently, some staying upright, others tipping or sliding only slightly. By the time the rear of the train reacted, the violence that had destroyed the head end had already burned itself out. In about 10 seconds, it was over. We stood at the wreck site in the snow. It was cold, quiet, empty. Nothing here suggested the violence of February 18th, 1947. There are no markers here, nothing to signal what happened on this slope 80 years ago. The scar left by the wreck was softened with time. The hillside, torn open in seconds, has grown back into forest. But we didn't come here looking for a monument. We came here to remember the people whose journeys ended here, and to tell their stories so that they don't disappear with the landscape.
So this is the exact site of the derailment. We brought some roses to place on the site just to remember the 24 victims who were lost here.
And if you look closely enough, traces of the disaster are still here, such as this knuckle coupler, which may possibly be from the Red Arrow.
You know, everything's still here, except for the train.
The story was over, but the memory wasn't. The Pennsylvania Railroad was sued by many of the survivors or families of the deceased, though they often settled out of court for non-disclosed sums of money. But not everyone felt the need to seek financial compensation. Ella Mae Wright was just grateful that she, her son, and her sister were alive. 2 New York lawyers showed up at her house to try to convince her to sue the railroad, but her husband threw them out. Engine man Michael Billig was found to be at fault for the disaster, but not held criminally accountable. He stayed with the Pennsylvania Railroad until his retirement, dying in 1983. He's buried in Calvary Cemetery in Altoona. The Red Arrow service continued after the wreck, with another train replacing the one that had been destroyed. The disaster didn't have much of an impact on ridership, but there was a natural decline in people riding the trains as the 1940s and 50s passed. The Red Arrow was eventually abbreviated, combined with other trains, and service was ultimately terminated in July 1960. Jim Corbett survived the wreck and was in the hospital for almost 3 weeks, and it was another 2 years before he returned to work. He stayed with the Pennsylvania Railroad, waitering for U.S. presidents and Hollywood celebrities.
Railroading was a thing that, it was your life. You lived railroad.
He seemed to love his time on the rails, but he said that every time there was the slightest bump, his mind would jump back to the Red Arrow. He died in 1997 and was buried in Alto Rest Park Cemetery in Altoona. We knew that much, but didn't know the exact location of his stone. On another cold day, we went looking. Every day of this production was cold like this, matching the conditions of the disaster, so I suppose it's fitting. We went through the cemetery armed only with a plot number. We were in the right spot, clearing off every stone nearby, but no Corbett. We found out later that his grave is unmarked by family choice, so a rose was left in the approximate area. Jim's son, Jim Corbett Jr., likes to think of his dad still working the dining car, still riding the railroad up in heaven with a big smile on his face. Though the victims and survivors have individual grave markings, there is none for the disaster overall. Nothing at Bennington, which is understandable considering how rarely visited it is. Nothing in Altoona. Nothing at Horseshoe Curve, 4 miles down the line. The only place where the story of the Red Arrow is kept alive today is at the Railroaders Memorial Museum.
And the Red Arrow, to this day, is something well known by local residents and is remembered as a big tragedy for Altoona and Blair County.
We began this story here in Altoona, beside one of the 2 remaining K4S locomotives. Up close, they feel indestructible, built in these shops to haul the finest trains the Pennsylvania Railroad ever offered. Today, 1361 is being carefully restored piece by piece. It's a slow, expensive labor of love, but one that tells the world that these machines and their stories still matter.
So the Railroaders Memorial Museum is rebuilding the K4 on the same grounds where it was constructed back in 1918.
On a winter morning in 1947, 2 locomotives just like this one left the rails 12 miles from here. There was no defect in the track. The curves had been taken safely thousands of times. What changed was the margin, a descent that gathered speed and a moment of judgment on an unforgiving grade. Once the Red Arrow moved beyond what Bennington Curve could hold, there was no chance of a recovery. 3 of the 4 men in the cab never came home, and the one who did carried it with him for the rest of his life. If you walk Bennington Curve today, there's nothing to announce what happened there. The hillside has grown quiet once again. Trains still descend the mountain, carefully controlling their speed as they approached the bend. On February 18, 1947, 24 journeys ended on that curve, just short of home. The city of Altoona and the surrounding areas rallied together to help those involved to provide the care and support needed during this time of trial. The trains still run, the mountain still stands, and the story, if we choose to remember it, is still here, preserved in archives, in families, and in places like the Railroaders Memorial Museum in Altoona, Pennsylvania. If you'd like to explore this story further, Dennis McIlnay's The Wreck of the Red Arrow offers the most complete account of the disaster and can be purchased through the museum's website. And thank you once again to the Wolf Kuhn Foundation for their financial support in the making of this documentary. And of course, a big thanks to my supporters on Patreon, and without them, this would not be possible. Thank you especially to Marlo Perez, Kelly Black, Kaiser Wilhelm II, Kaiser Friedrich III, Zach Richards, Donald Anderson, Cody Henricks, Joan Haynes, Sean Kimball, Glenn Biddiscombe, Stephen Schwankert, Gabriel Colomb, RGB, Tara Mullicar, Keith Holland, Rob M., Amos Mayhew, Corey Andrews, Nicholas Masella, Cole Tannick, Sophie Baber, Rob, Oliver Chin Chen, John Maluski, David Watipka, Tiffany Raridan, Mad Time Media, Nathan Gutierrez, Max Metcalf, David Littlejohn, Sean Sahi Fraser, Nikki Chan 92, Corbin McDonald, Matthew Burns, Goblin of the Salt Plains, Luke Stevens, Gordon Robbins, Aaron Stark, Troy Wentworth, Clarkey, Sam Forker, Busy B, Christopher Rosendale, Road Weary, Kitty Bits, Taniel 38, Kenzo Buick, Brian Reedy, Eden Cleefish, Bless Moles, Coda Yoda 16, Carol Adams, Clay Hobbs, Steve Valley, Gojira Strains, JC Hobbs, High Treason, The Peppermilk, Tristan White, Jason Stray, Chance Hudson, Robert Mayer III, Jordan Page, The Handler, Georgia T., Drew Shelton, Craven Moorhead, Jennifer and Sarah Vaughn, Ben Reese, Kenneth Hendricks, Aaron Prochaska, David Douglas, Alan and Modesta Charlone, Eric Castle, Lottie Katz, Jean Kennedy, Lilia Bean, Bianca Signorini, Greg The Fox Bauer, Jeffrey Gautier, Tim C., Paul Bowman, Hope Harvey, Heidi Geldian, Gamer Chick 42, Jennifer Robinson, Ezra Noster, Asburn the Barbarian, John Corbett, Drake Gilliland, Sandra Dunn West, Michael Kozdeba, Troy Sturris, Joe Hitchman, Craig Luna, Danny Strasser, Andrew Beveridge, Samuel Masson, Ashley Nicholson, and Rat.